And again, the title of the exhort is Man Up Like Mordecai.
Can someone grab the one light here to go off? Thank you. So I have a small confession to begin. I thought today was Father's Day. So, yeah. If you think this has something to do with Father's Day, well, it's to get you thinking for next week, I guess. So, man up like Mordecai. Anybody know who this is? How'd you know? How would you know? It's a girl named Anne Frank, a little girl, perhaps 13. I'm amazed anybody knew that. Like, I would never know that. And it's like, of course we know.
I was the same age at that time.
Oh, Mickey was the same age in World War II. Well, yikes. That means you're older than that today. So if you don't know, there was this girl named Anne Frank, and she became kind of famous. So in World War II, you know about the Germans and the Holocaust. So what she did is she started writing down her experiences every day, as a young 13-year-old might, and that later became famous. It became Anne Frank's diary. And initially it was not very famous. It took a long time, actually, for her to become famous. But this is just to give you a little information about her. Now, the real kind of hero of the story is her dad. So I hope Otto's watching today, because he'll catch his name right off. His name is Otto. So her dad was someone significant, and without him, we would know nothing about Anne Frank. So, who was Otto Frank? Well, he was her dad, of course. He did fight for Germany in World War I, and he was decorated, in fact. So he did move the family away to get away from Hitler. He tried actually to move the family to New York and England and other places. In those days, nobody would take the Jews. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in all countries, our country included. People did not want the Jews. So he did the best he could. He got to Netherlands. And he started this business, which I found kind of fascinating. It was an herbal business with pectin and spices. And I thought, I think I know a little bit about that kind of business. So that's what he did, and it was until 1940. Now earlier, I think about 1933, Hitler had outlawed Jewish ownership in Germany. So when he went to the Netherlands, he set up his business, he owned it. But in 1940, Hitler and Germany took over the Netherlands, and they imposed the same laws. So if you were a Jew, you could not own a business. So he owned it till 1940, and then kind of sort of worked for his workers. So his workers took over the business because he was not allowed to own it. So about this time, he could see things were getting really bad and his options were not very good. So he decided to build this hiding place within his work. And that's what he did. So he started a couple years earlier, and that's what, if you saw that bookcase in that first picture, there was this hidden wall behind a wall. And so when the bad Nazis came to look for people, they didn't see it. They didn't recognize it. So the family is in a very small, tight place. So he trusted his employees, and the employees were trustful because in those days, certainly if you were hiding a Jew, your life, you'd be shot instantly. There was two families that hid there. So his family was one, and they took in another family, and I think another one or two people. So things were not smooth and happy for those 2 years. You can imagine being stuck in something like that for 2 years. families that just don't know each other very well and just get stuck together, a lot of conflict. So Anne Frank wrote about the conflict in some of her writings. So in 1944 they were found, unfortunately. So Otto Frank, the dad, was taken to one concentration camp. The rest of the family was taken somewhere else. The rest of them were killed. Otto survived, so he lived 1 year in a concentration camp, and then he was freed. And then a couple years later, he published Anne Frank's diary. At that point, it didn't really do anything. Like I said, it didn't become popular, but it did become popular later. So her dad said this afterward. He's the only surviving family member. He said, "We cannot change what happened anymore. The only thing we can do is to learn from the past and to realize what discrimination and persecution of innocent people means. I believe that it's everyone's responsibility to fight prejudice." So I thought that was a good quote from him. And now when we get to Mordecai and Esther and the Jews here, you're going to see a similar story where the whole nation's at risk of perishing, and Mordecai is the one who really ends up saving the day. So a transition, a proverb says, "The father of godly children has cause for joy. What a pleasure to have children who are wise." And perhaps that's what Anne Frank was. Of course, she was just a kid, just trying to survive, and unfortunately she didn't. But this morning we're going to talk about Mordecai. So I don't know how much you know about Mordecai, but I thought, we need to look at some characters that maybe we don't know a lot about, and Mordecai is one. So we found the reading in Esther 2, and if you would, open your Bible to Esther 2. Keep your hand there because we're going to move around a little bit. But Esther 2 gives the introduction to Mordecai. So chapter 1, you have Queen Vashti. She disobeys the king. He kicks her out. And then chapter 2, he's out looking for a new queen. And that's where Mordecai and Esther come in. So we know this about Mordecai. He's the son of Kish. That's an interesting name because, of course, King Saul was the son of Kish. Different Kish, we assume. He's a Benjaminite, and Saul was a Benjaminite. It looks like his father, Kish. It's not clear if his father was carried away or he was carried away. I think it was his father who was carried away by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon. And Mordecai raised his either niece or his cousin, and that's also a little bit unclear. It depends which version you have and which verse you look at. You think it's pretty clear in your version until you look at another version. So I think it's his niece. If it was his cousin, she was a decent amount younger than he was. So roughly the years here are 483 to 473 BC. So what's that? 2,500 years ago, roughly. And I thought it was interesting that the name in Esther, Mordecai, is mentioned 60 times. That's more than Esther in the book of Esther. So he's really the main figure here, much more than the king, much more than anybody else. So he's kind of our character today. So what about Haman? There are some key events about Haman, actually some big events, and the more you look at his life, there was a lot of them, and everything he did was right. So there's nothing that's said about Mordecai that's bad. Now the one thing, if you know Esther, the book is missing one thing. What's Esther missing? The name of God. So God or Lord is not mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther, which is very unusual. I don't know if it's the only book of the Bible that has that. I hear yes. I think I've heard that. So it's very interesting. Maybe it was kind of hidden like code that for some reason, they didn't want that mentioned. I don't know. But we do know in chapter 2 that he raised Esther as his own daughter. So he took care of her, and I'm sure she had a need. So we know in chapter 2, verse 21, where it says this. It says, "In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials who guarded the door, they became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence." So that little tidbit, is kind of like, all right, that's not significant, but it becomes really significant later. So that's like that's actually the second big thing that Mordecai does. The first thing is taking care of Esther. So the second thing is he happens to be in the right place in the right time, and he makes the right decision. Now you go on a little farther into Esther chapter 3, and we meet a new character, and that is Haman the Agagite. Haman the Agagite. Anybody know anything about Agagite? No. Well, look back to 1 Samuel 15. Assuming this is the same Agag who became the Agagites. We're assuming that. 1 Samuel 15 is basically Saul being told to go and punish Amalek because what he did to Israel on the way from Egypt. That's in 1 Samuel 15, verse 2. So Saul's told to go and utterly destroy Amalek, and it turns out that the king of Amalek is a guy named Agag the Amalekites. So it turns out Saul goes and wins the battle, but he didn't kill Agag like he was supposed to, and Samuel came and finished that off. So you think that those folks are all dead as a people, but they weren't, because here comes this guy named Haman in Esther chapter 3, and he's called the Agagite. So there's like war between these peoples. Like this is going on, this would be like, 500, 600 years later? That's a long time. So somehow the people survived, and Agag gets to be number 2 in the land, number 2 to the king, and he's going to have a plan that's going to be a problem. So as he goes through the town here, it turns out that everyone's got to bow before him, because of course he's Mr. Wonderful, but Mordecai doesn't. So it looks like the king made a command to do that, because in Esther 3:3 it says, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" So the king had commanded everyone to bow down to him, and that's a really big deal not to obey the king, right? Whenever the king says something, you better do it. You know what happens other places if you don't obey the king. So a little later on, chapter 3, Haman decides to really get vengeance. He decides not just to kill Mordecai, but to kill all the Jews. So now they're in trouble, and now there's going to be prayer and fasting, even though the name of God is not mentioned at all. So Mordecai appeals to Esther. This is what he sees, and I think there's a lot that's unsaid here, because God is not mentioned. There's almost like a spiritual element missing, but it's really there. It's just behind the scenes. So he appeals to Esther to save the people. In fact, he says, perhaps you've been raised for this position just like a time for this, to help save his people. Later on, Mordecai is rewarded by the king, and he's honored. So this is after Haman's found out, Haman's killed, and Mordecai takes his place, and pretty soon he's going to find himself second in command in the whole country. It kind of reminds you of Joseph, doesn't it? Joseph goes from a nobody to number 2 in the land just like that, and that's pretty much what happens to Mordecai. So here's an interesting little map. It'll give you, or a chart, it gives you a timeline of these events. So it's roughly a 10-year period here where Mordecai has his events in the whole book of Esther. So the verse says, "This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa." Now, Susa today is in modern Iraq, right next to Iran, so almost both. So in those days, Babylon, Persia, whatever empire is in charge is going to own that territory. So you just kind of get a feel for the prophets. I don't know if you can see the bottom left there. You have Haggai and Zechariah, so that's their time. And then the bottom right there, you see Ezra and Nehemiah. So that's kind of the time frame, and that's the end of the Old Testament. So you have the last couple prophets in the bottom left, and the last couple books in the bottom right. So we read in, again, Levi read this before, back to Esther 2, it says, "There was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin, or niece, named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who is also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother had died." So you get kind of just a little impression of there's going to be an age difference because he's going to be older and she's going to be younger. And he seems to kind of be the one taking care of her, telling her what to do, and she seems very obedient and doing things right. So another look at Esther here. Now look at Esther 2, verse 16 and 17. Here's Esther in her her glory at this point, you can see. So Esther 2, verse 16, it says, "So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head, and he made her queen instead of Vashti." So there's a lot of things going on in the story of Esther. And, you start wondering about what's unsaid. There's a lot unsaid, too. Like, you get the idea Mordecai just hung out at the gate all his life. I don't think that's what happened, because he's a foreigner. He doesn't have anything. So he's going to have to work somehow during the day, but you get the feeling maybe at nighttime or sometime when he had a break, he'd always go there and check on Esther to make sure things were okay. So we have this incident at the end of Esther 2, where Mordecai, we read that already. Mordecai reports on these, and this seems to be a special act of God. Didn't just happen, that two guys planned to kill a king, and it just so happened that Mordecai heard about it. Like, I don't think these kinds of things are known. Like, they weren't all at the bar and saying, "Hey, you want to kill the king on Friday?" And he says, "Yeah, let's do it." And Mordecai's listening. Somehow there's acts of God that go on in Mordecai's life, and I think that go on in our life, that we don't recognize unless we pause to think. Like, I think that's a good question for us to ask, is when God acts in our life, we have to think about it. We have to be aware of it. We have to look for that. So, as you know in this story, so Mordecai did the right thing. He informed on the king, and that led to the next stage. So Esther 3, we have the story about Mordecai refusing to bow down. There's a good image of them. And you can imagine, if you're Haman, you're the main man, the number 2 man in the land, this is not going to go over well. So, why didn't he bow down? Maybe it's obvious. It says he's a Jew. It doesn't really give any more detail than that, except for being a Jew. So just a couple passages to refer to. One's in Deuteronomy 6. I think you probably know why he doesn't bow down. But Deuteronomy 6, verse 13, it says, this is the law. It says, "You shall fear only the Lord your God, and you shall worship him and swear by his name. You shall not follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples who surround you. For the Lord your God is in your midst, is a jealous God. Otherwise the anger of the Lord your God will be kindled against you, and he will wipe you off the face of the earth." So Haman certainly wasn't a god, but they were told not to bow down to anyone or anything. So a little later on, I think you know the story in Daniel of 3 special men who come up in Daniel 3, verse 15. They had a similar thing where they were told to bow down to an idol. And of course, they chose not to. So in Daniel 3, we have the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And Nebuchadnezzar says to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready at this moment, you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, all these musical instruments. If you fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you will not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" So they had a decision to make, and they made the right decision. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But, even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. All right, so they took a stand, right? Remember, this is about Mordecai. Take a stand. Men, stand up. So that's what Mordecai does here. He doesn't bow down at the risk of his life. And it's really not, it doesn't say it that well in Esther. But you can be sure it's at the risk of his life that he doesn't bow down. Of course, Acts later on says that we ought to obey God rather than men. And that's what Mordecai did. So Mordecai decides to appeal to Esther. Of course, she's in a great position. He's not. He's just an enslaved person living in a foreign land, probably a person of no consequence. So Mordecai appeals to her in Esther 4. He says, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another." It will arise from another. He doesn't say it might. It will arise from another. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to this royal position for such a time as this. Well, that's something that he says here. So he really lays it out there like you got to stand up. This is kind of like going back to Anne Frank. They of course hid. They did the best they could. And in this case, her uncle is appealing to her to do the best that she can. So how about you? If you're in a position like this, most of us don't get caught up to this big of a deal where we have to save the whole nation, right? But we do have decisions to make often where we go one way or we go another way. And of course, we usually know what's right to do, but to do it is the hard part. So that's part of our lesson, our thinking. Meanwhile, back to Esther chapter 6, actually. Look forward a little bit. So Haman is scheming to kill not just Mordecai, but all the Jews. So of course, it just so happens that there's this dream in Esther chapter 6. The king has this thing. Well, it's not a dream, but he can't sleep. So he wakes up and, he wants to read something. I guess a lot of us like to read and be put to sleep. So he happens to read about Mordecai turning in the bad guys. And of course he says, well, what happened to that good man? It turned out nothing had happened. So Proverbs 11 has a little thought on that. Proverbs 11, verse 27. Says, "He who diligently seeks good seeks favor, but he who searches after evil, it will come to him." And that was Haman. He searched after evil and it came to him. "He who trusts in his riches will fall." And that was Haman too. "But the righteous will flourish like the green leaf. He who troubles his own house will inherit wind, and the foolish will be servant to the wise-hearted." So I thought that was a good set of proverbs specifically about Haman and Mordecai. So what Mordecai and Esther did really changed history. One way, the law had already been set that all the Jews are going to be killed. That's what Haman's law had already determined. So they stepped in, they represented the Jewish people, and they acted. Of course, he wouldn't bow down, and she was quiet at the time. She kind of was keeping her peace and waiting for her moment. They both risked their lives. They both sacrificed at great risk for themselves. Yet they seized the moment because it was an opportunity. Just as Mordecai said, who knows if you've been put in this moment in place. And maybe you felt like that at some point in your life where you've been in a certain situation and you have to wonder, was this just coincidence that I'm here? Life is not about coincidence. Spiritual life certainly isn't. So these two, they work together as a team from youth all the way up till he becomes second in command, and she really becomes the one commanding. So when she's young, of course, he commands her what to do. Well, when she's older and he tells her to go talk to the king, things switch because she commands him. Remember what she commands him to do? To fast, to pray and fast. Well, it doesn't say pray, but I'm assuming praying and fasting for 3 days and 3 nights. It uses the word command, so that's an interesting change there. And actually later on, after they have success, there's this new Jewish holiday that comes out of this. It's called Purim. And they do this to celebrate Esther and her deliverance of the people. So both of them are rewarded, they both get honor, and they both get peace for their people. It's a great thing. In Esther 8, later on, it says, when Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, just like that. A large crown of gold and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration for the Jews. It was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. So now we have a preaching opportunity that comes forth. So that gives you a bit about Mordecai. I want to show you something that I hope works this morning, and we'll see if it works. It worked in practice. It worked in practice up here, too.
The man I wanted to see. What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?
Do you have sound, Nick?
Delights to honor. This man must be very deserving and important.
Absolutely.
You turn it up?
Well then, I know exactly what to do. First, bring a set of royal robes that the king himself has worn. And bring one of the king's favorite horses. Let one of his majesty's highest officials lead the man through the city and proclaim, "Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king delights to honor."
That's perfect. Brilliant. Yes. I want you to do everything you've said. The horse, the robes, everything. For Mordecai the Jew. I want the ceremony to last all day. And Haman, I want you to sing a song in his honor. The greatest song ever written.
Who's that man who saved the king? Who's the reason why we stand and sing? Who's that man who wins the prize? Who is favored in King Xerxes' eyes?
Mordecai, we thunder, so we speak his name, our faces glow. Oh, Mordecai, he can't be beat, he simply is a treat. Mordecai's the best there is. We sat down and we wrote a list on Mordecai's best attributes, which no one can refute. He's friendly and he's very smart. He's funnier than modern art. His beaming smile can melt the coldest heart. Please kill me, Mordecai. He wins the prize. He's favored in King Xerxes' eyes. So Mordecai, this song's for you. We hope your dreams come true.
This celebration went on 4 hours.
Mordecai's the nicest, truest. When he sneezes, he says, "Bless you." Oh, Mordecai's considerate. That's why he's such a hit. Mordecai, he takes the cake. He puts the shake and bake. Yes, Mordecai, he's no man's rule. That's why he's really cool. He's totally a muscle man. There's nobody who's stronger than him. He could kill a bear with his bare hand. Mordecai goes to our head. There's only one thing to be said. Mordecai, a battle cry. What a guy! 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 Brave and daring, loving, loyal. He's an honorary royal. Oh, but wait, there's more. What a guy! What a guy! What a guy! What a guy! Ain't nobody else who can come close to being quite as handsome. Oh, we just adore that. Mordecai, he's one of the So Mordecai will tell you now how great you are and how.
Not only is Mordecai worthy of the greatest song ever sung, but he's also worthy of the greatest dance ever danced!
Mordecai, 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 M-O-R-D-E-C-A. I spelled the name of this here great guy. Mordecai, 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 Mordecai. To show you we're not lazy, spell it backwards. I-A-C-E-D-R-O-N. Mordecai, he wins the prize. He's favored in King Xerxes' eyes. So Mordecai, this song's for you. We hope your dreams come. Mordecai, oh 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 Mordecai, Mordecai.
Haman, are you bowing to me?
Your Majesty.
Majesty.
All right, thanks, Nick, for
Oh,
making it
hey,
work.
just
Nick
a
is a
man.
hero today.
What should be done for the man whom the king delights to...
No. So I thought that was a little fun with Mordecai. But the real point is, so what? All right, so Mordecai had some fun. He's got a great story. So what? What does it mean for us? Well, I think actually Mordecai's example leads us to Jesus in maybe ways that we don't think about. Like Mordecai, Jesus said, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Now you might remember, I didn't say this in the middle stories, but Haman had built this wood gallows to hang Mordecai on. And it turned out that Haman got hanged on it. But you have this imagery of this wood pole built for Mordecai, and somehow he's spared. It's kind of like the Old Testament with Abraham and Isaac, where Isaac was spared. Images of Jesus. So in some ways, Mordecai was a type of Christ. In fact, quite a few ways. Like Jesus, Mordecai became a savior of the Jews. He saved the people. Without him, without Esther, without either of them, the people would have been destroyed. So he delivered them from a death sentence. Like Jesus, Mordecai refused to bow down and worship, just as Jesus did the same in his temptations. Like Jesus, the Jews were exiled from Jerusalem at the time, and yet life was preserved from death. Like Jesus, Mordecai mentored and cared for his brethren. Like Jesus, Mordecai was involved with two who were condemned, who were impaled. Like Jesus, Mordecai triumphed over the cross and the pole for impaling. Like Jesus, there was a dream, there was a loss of sleep issue, just like there was for Pilate's wife. It affected the leader to make a decision. Like Jesus, Mordecai was honored to ride on a chosen horse with a robe. Like Jesus, Mordecai welcomed to the kingly banquet, the great banquet to come. Like Jesus, the enemy that was destroyed was death. And that's what it says in Hebrews 2:14, that through Jesus' death he destroyed him who had the power of death. That was the devil. Like Jesus, Mordecai elevated to lead his country. He became number 2. And you might say Jesus sitting at God's right hand is in that role himself. Like Jesus, Mordecai initiated a memorial, a regular celebration of what they had experienced, just like Jesus initiated our memorial service for us to remember him. Like Jesus, Mordecai worked for the good of his people. He was preeminent among the Jewish people, even as Jesus is preeminent among us today. So what? Well, we're here because of the good news of the kingdom of God. The question I would leave with you, do you want to be in the kingdom? Then be like Jesus. You want to be like Jesus? Be like Mordecai. That's how we know. And especially for the men, if this was Men's Day, I'd say, watch ye, stand fast in the faith, and you, quit ye like men, be strong. So finally, a verse for all. As Jesus said, come to me, all of you who weary and are overburdened, and I will give you rest. Put on my yoke and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.